September 15, 1945, brought an autumn chill to the mountains of northern Honshu, where Camp 17 had housed nearly 300 Japanese women who had been classified as prisoners of war under unusual circumstances. These women, mostly nurses, teachers, and government workers who had been captured during the final island campaigns, huddled in their thin cotton uniforms as American trucks rumbled through the camp gates. Captain Margaret O'Brien stepped down from the lead vehicle, her Red Cross armband catching the morning light. Behind her, Sergeant James Patterson directed a convoy of supply trucks loaded with medical equipment, blankets, and most remarkably, fresh food that would transform everything these women understood about American military provisions. The camp commandant, Colonel Takeshi Yamamoto, had maintained strict discipline even after Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast. The women sat in perfect rows outside their barracks, their faces ant from months of rice gruel and pickled vegetables. Most weighed barely 90 pounds, their eyes hollow with the exhaustion that came from surviving on 1,300 calories daily. This account draws from declassified records of the American Red Cross Pacific operations, 1945 to 1946. Nurse Akiko Tanaka, 24 years old and formerly stationed at a military hospital in Saipan, watched the American vehicles with mixture of fear and curiosity. She had been captured during the final evacuation GTS in July, along with 42 other medical personnel who had refused to abandon their patients. Now, as the senior-ranking woman among the prisoners, she found herself appointed as unofficial liaison between the Japanese women and their liberators. "They're bringing food," whispered Nurse Sachiko Watanabe, barely audible. The women had learned to speak softly during their months of captivity, their voices carrying the weight of uncertainty about what surrender would mean for them. Captain O'Brien approached the formation of women with careful, measured steps. She had worked in occupied territories before, but nothing had prepared her for the stark contrast between Japanese military prisoners and the defeated soldiers she had encountered in Europe. These women maintained an almost supernatural composure, despite their obvious malnutrition and exhaustion. The morning sun climbed higher as American soldiers began unloading the supply trucks. The Japanese women watched with growing amazement as case after case of canned goods, fresh vegetables, and what appeared to be large cuts of meat emerged from the vehicles. The aroma of coffee brewing over portable field stoves began to drift across the compound, a scent most of them had not experienced in over a year. The mess tent that American engineers erected within 3 hours defied everything the Japanese women had experienced during their captivity. Long tables with white canvas coverings replaced the wooden benches where they had eaten their meager rations. Most shocking of all were the portable grills that Sergeant Patterson's men assembled, their charcoal already glowing red-hot by noon. Akiko approached Captain O'Brien hesitantly, bowing deeply before speaking in carefully practiced English. "Honorable American officer, we wish to understand your intentions regarding our sustenance." Her mal language reflected years of English study, but her voice trembled with the unfamiliarity of addressing a captor who seemed intent on hospitality rather than punishment. "You'll eat the same rations as our soldiers," Captain O'Brien replied, her tone gentle but firm. "No one in American custody GOE's hungry." She gestured toward the grills where large steaks were already beginning to sizzle, their fat rendering and creating aromatic smoke that made several of the Japanese women unconsciously step closer. The concept proved almost impossible for the women to comprehend. For 8 months, their daily meals had consisted of thin rice porridge, occasional pickled cabbage, and on fortunate days, small portions of dried fish. The sight of thick beef steaks, each weighing more than their typical weekly protein allocation, created a cognitive dissonance that left many of them staring in silent bewilderment. Nurse Watanabe approached one of the American cooks, Private Michael Rodriguez from San Antonio, Texas, who was turning the steaks with practiced expertise. "Excuse me," she said in halting English, "this meat, it is for us?" Private Rodriguez looked up from his grill, spatula in hand, and smiled broadly. "Yes, ma'am, medium rare okay with you? We've got some nice potatoes baking too and corn on the cob." His casual friendliness seemed to perplex her more than hostility might have. The afternoon proceeded with a surreal quality as American soldiers served heaping plates of food to their former enemies. Each plate contained a 10-ounce ribeye steak, baked potato with butter, corn on the cob, fresh bread rolls, and green beans. The portions exceeded what most of the women had consumed in an entire week during their recent captivity. Yuki Matsumoto, a former elementary school teacher from Kyushu, stared at her plate for several minutes before attempting to eat. The steak, cooked to a perfect medium rare, represented more animal protein than she had seen in months. The butter melting on the potato seemed like an impossible luxury, and the fresh bread rolls felt soft and warm in her hands. The evening meal became an anthropological study in cultural adaptation under extraordinary circumstances. The Japanese women, despite their hunger, approached the abundant American food with the same methodical precision he had maintained throughout their ordeal. They sat upright, used improvised chopsticks carved from wooden splinters, and attempted to eat the large steaks in small, dignified bites. Corporal William Thompson, a farm boy from Nebraska, watched with fascination as the women tried to navigate corn on the cob using their makeshift utensils. "Hey, Sarge," he called to Patterson. "Should we show them how to eat the corn?" "Let them figure it out," Patterson replied, understanding instinctively that preserving the women's dignity was more important than efficiency. He had spent enough time in the Pacific Theater to recognize that these women were struggling not just with unfamiliar food, but with the complete upheaval of their understanding of American military behavior. Michiko Hayashi, who had been a radio operator for Japanese naval communications, found herself overwhelmed by the richness of the food. After months of subsisting on rice and vegetables, the fatty steak caused immediate digestive distress. She excused herself quietly, maintaining her composure even as her body rejected the sudden influx of protein and fat. Captain O'Brien noticed the pattern as several other women left the mess tent looking uncomfortable. She quickly consulted with the unit's medic, Corporal Robert Chen, whose Chinese-American heritage had given him some insight into Asian dietary customs. "They need smaller portions," he advised. "Their systems can't handle this much rich food at once." The medical officer's assessment proved correct. Within 2 hours, nearly half the Japanese women were experiencing nausea and stomach cramps. However, rather than viewing this as American malice, they interpreted it as evidence of their captors' ignorance about proper nutrition, which somehow made the Americans seem more human and less threatening. As night fell over the camp, the Japanese women gathered in small groups to discuss the day's extraordinary events. Speaking in hushed Japanese, they shared their bewilderment at American generosity toward prisoners. Traditional Japanese military culture emphasized that capture brought shame, and prisoners could expect harsh treatment as punishment for their failure to die honorably. "They give us food better than their own officers eat," observed Keiko Taniguchi, a former government clerk who had been captured during the evacuation of Okinawa. "This is not the behavior of victorious warriors toward the defeated." The complexity of their situation created philosophical challenges that extended beyond mere survival. These women had been raised with concepts of honor and shame that provided no framework for understanding benevolent captors who served ribeye steaks to their enemies. September 20th arrived with the distinctive aroma of hickory smoke drifting across the compound. The American soldiers had constructed a proper barbecue pit using local stones and salvaged metal, transforming YH at had been a sterile prison camp into something resembling a community gathering place. For the Japanese women, this represented their introduction to one of America's most distinctive culinary traditions. Sergeant Patterson stood before the massive smoking pit, tending to 2 whole pork shoulders that had been slow cooking since dawn. The meat, rubbed with spices that most of the Japanese women had never encountered, represented a cooking philosophy entirely foreign to their culinary traditions. Where Japanese cuisine emphasized subtle flavors and minimal seasoning, American barbecue celebrated bold, complex spice combinations that filled the air for hundreds of yards. "Today's going to be different," Captain O'Brien announced to the assembled women through Akiko's translation. "We're having what Americans call a barbecue. It's how we celebrate community and friendship." The concept of celebrating with former enemies struck the Japanese women as so paradoxical that several began to wonder if this was some elaborate psychological warfare technique. The preparation ritual fascinated the women as much as the food itself. They watched American soldiers laughing and joking as they prepared side dishes, their casual camaraderie during meal preparation contrasting sharply with the formal hierarchical structure they expected from military units. Private Rodriguez demonstrated his grandmother's corn salad recipe while Corporal Thompson shared stories about church barbecues in Nebraska. When the pork shoulders were finally ready, Sergeant Patterson carved thick slices of meat that fell apart at the touch of his knife. The exterior bore a dark, spiced crust, while the interior remained incredibly tender and moist. He served each woman a generous portion alongside coleslaw, baked beans, and cornbread that had been prepared in cast-iron Dutch ovens. Fumiko Sato, a former bank clerk from Nagasaki, took her first bite of barbecued pork with extreme caution. The explosion of flavors overwhelmed her palate, smoky, sweet, spicy, and rich all at once. She chewed slowly, her expression cycling through confusion, surprise, and what might have been pleasure. The meat's tenderness required no effort to eat, unlike the tough, scarce protein they had received during captivity. "This is not food," she whispered to her neighbor in Japanese. "This is something else entirely." The cornbread proved equally revelatory. Its slightly sweet taste and crumbly texture bore no resemblance to the rice that had been their staple carbohydrate for decades. Several women examined it carefully before eating, trying to determine its ingredients and preparation method through observation alone. The afternoon barbecue evolved into something approaching a social gathering as Americans and Japanese found themselves sharing the same tables for the first time. Language barriers prevented deep conversation, but the universal human experience of sharing food created moments of unexpected connection. The days following the barbecue brought a new understanding of American abundance that transcended mere nutrition. The Japanese women found themselves processing not just unfamiliar foods, but an entirely different philosophy of resource allocation and social hierarchy. In their experience, military leaders ate first and best while subordinates received whichever remained. The American practice of serving identical meals to officers and enlisted men, and even to prisoners, challenged fundamental assumptions about power structures. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a nutritionist from the Army Medical Corps who arrived on September 22nd, conducted health assessments that revealed the extent of the women's malnutrition. "Most of these women have lost 25 to 30% of their body weight," she reported to Captain O'Brien. "Their digestive systems need gradual rehabilitation, not sudden abundance." Under Dr. Mitchell's guidance, the meal program adapted to accommodate the women's recovering digestive systems. Portions were reduced, and meals became more frequent, allowing their bodies to slowly adjust to increased protein and fat intake. This careful attention to their medical needs further confused the Japanese women's understanding of their captors' motivations. Akiko found herself appointed as unofficial cultural interpreter between the two groups. Her English, while formal and sometimes stilted, enabled communication that went beyond basic commands and responses. She spent hours with Captain O'Brien, trying to explain Japanese dietary customs while learning about American food traditions. "In Japan, we eat to sustain life," Akiko explained during one of these conversations. "Americans seem to eat for pleasure, for celebration, for social connection. This is very strange to us." She paused, searching for words to express concepts that had no direct translation. "Food is art, entertainment? We do not understand." Captain O'Brien recognized the deeper cultural implications of what she was witnessing. "For many Americans, sharing food is how we show care for others," she replied. "When we cook for someone, we're telling them they matter to us." This concept proved almost impossible for Akiko to translate into Japanese, as their language contained no equivalent expression for the emotional significance Americans attached to feeding others. The gradual dietary improvement brought unexpected psychological changes among the women. As their physical strength returned, they began showing more curiosity about their American captors. Some attempted to help with food preparation, though their offers were politely declined by soldiers following regulations about prisoner labor. Michiko, the former radio operator, spent hours watching American cooking techniques with the intensity of a scholar studying ancient texts. She observed how they seasoned meat before cooking, how they tested doneness by touch rather than time, and how they seemed to cook with intuition rather than precise measurements. These observations filled notebooks she kept hidden in her sleeping area. The evening of September 25th brought another revelation when Private Rodriguez produced a guitar and began playing country music, while the women finished their dinner. The concept of entertainment during mealtime was foreign to their experience, yet several found themselves unconsciously swaying to the unfamiliar rhythms. October 1st marked 2 weeks since the American liberation, and the introduction of desserts represented perhaps the most profound cultural shock the Japanese women had experienced. When Corporal Thompson announced that he was preparing apple pie to celebrate his sister's birthday back in Nebraska, the women could not comprehend the connection between personal celebration and elaborate food preparation for strangers. The pie itself defied their understanding of appropriate sweetness levels. American desserts, with their concentrated sugar content and rich dairy components, represented indulgence on a scale that seemed almost immoral to women raised on subtle sweets made from rice and beans. The first bite of apple pie a la mode caused visible reactions ranging from surprise to something approaching alarm. Nurse Watanabe examined her slice with scientific curiosity, trying to identify the ingredients and understand the preparation process. "This contains more sugar than we would consume in a month," she observed in Japanese to her table companions. How do Americans remain healthy, eating such foods regularly? The question sparked discussions about American dietary habits that revealed fundamental differences in how the two cultures approached food and health. The Japanese women had been raised to believe that restraint in eating demonstrated both moral virtue and practical wisdom. American abundance seemed to violate both principles simultaneously. Dr. Mitchell, recognizing the cultural dimensions of the dietary adjustment, organized informal cooking demonstrations where American soldiers explained their preparation techniques while allowing the Japanese women to observe safely. These sessions became impromptu cultural exchange programs where both groups shared stories about their home region's specialties. Private Rodriguez described his grandmother's tamale-making process during Christmas celebrations, while Akiko explained the ceremonial aspects of tea preparation and seasonal food customs. These conversations revealed that both cultures invested food with emotional and spiritual significance, though they expressed these connections very differently. The apple pie incident led to more gradual dessert introductions. Dr. Mitchell suggested serving smaller portions of less intensely sweet items, beginning with fresh fruit and progressing slowly toward more complex American desserts. This approach proved more successful, though the Japanese women continued to regard American sweet consumption as evidence of either admirable abundance or concerning excess. As October progressed, the women began requesting second helpings of certain items while politely declining others. They developed preferences for grilled meats, but remained skeptical of heavily sauced dishes. Fresh vegetables were universally appreciated, though they preferred them less cooked than typical American preparations. The gradual dietary adaptation paralleled a broader psychological adjustment, as the women began to understand that their captivity might be temporary rather than permanent. Captain O'Brien had received preliminary orders regarding repatriation procedures, though she had not yet shared this information with the prisoners. October 8th brought the arrival of Major Patricia Williams, a logistics officer tasked with organizing repatriation procedure for Japanese prisoners throughout the Pacific Theater. Her presence signaled that the women's time in American custody was approaching an end, though this transition raised new anxieties about returning to a defeated Japan where food scarcity would likely be severe. Major Williams observed the unusual dynamic that had developed between captors and prisoners with professional interest. "I visited 12 prisoner facilities in the past month," she told Captain O'Brien during their first meeting. "This is the only location where prisoners appear to have gained weight and improved health during captivity. The transformation was indeed remarkable. The women who had arrived weighing an average of 90 pounds now approached their normal body weights. Their improved nutrition showed in clearer skin, brighter eyes, and increased energy levels that translated into greater curiosity about their surroundings and circumstances. This physical improvement coincided with a growing understanding of American military culture, that challenged many of their preconceptions about Western attitudes toward honor, hierarchy, and treatment of enemies. The American practice of maintaining high morale through good food, entertainment, and informal social interactions seemed to violate everything they had been taught about proper military discipline. Yuki Matsumoto, the former teacher, had been observing American behavior with the analytical skills she once applied to lesson planning. They do not separate personal happiness from military efficiency, she noted in her hidden journal. They believe that comfortable, well-fed soldiers fight better than hungry, disciplined ones. This is completely opposite to our training. Her observations proved accurate. The American soldiers maintained their operational effectiveness while displaying casual friendliness that would have been considered inappropriate in Japanese military culture. They joked with officers, expressed personal opinions about orders, and showed genuine care for the welfare of their prisoners. The October 10th barbecue, organized to celebrate Major Williams's visit, demonstrated how thoroughly the food-sharing ritual had become integrated into the camp's routine. The Japanese women now participated with less hesitation, though they continued to eat smaller portions and avoid the spiciest preparations. During this meal, something approaching genuine conversation occurred between several Americans and Japanese despite language barriers. Gestures, shared laughter over mishaps, and mutual appreciation for the food created moments of human connection that transcended political and military divisions. Sergeant Patterson, who had initially been skeptical about fraternizing with prisoners, found himself genuinely concerned about the women's welfare upon repatriation. "What kind of food situation are they returning to?" he asked Major Williams privately. "If Japan's still experiencing shortages, sending them back seems cruel after all this." His concern reflected a broader moral complexity that several American personnel were beginning to experience. Having invested weeks in rebuilding these women's health and morale, the prospect of returning them to potentially harsh conditions created ethical questions that military regulation had not anticipated. October 15th arrived with the bittersweet announcement that repatriation would begin within 1 week. The Japanese women received this news with mixed emotions, yearning for their homeland while apprehensive about leaving the security and abundance they had experienced in American custody. Captain O'Brien decided to organize a farewell dinner that would serve as both celebration and cultural bridge between two worlds. The preparation for this final meal became a collaborative effort that violated numerous military protocols while serving deeper humanitarian purposes. Several Japanese women were allowed to help prepare rice dishes using traditional methods, while American cooks adapted their techniques to create fusion dishes that honored both culinary traditions. Akiko worked alongside Corporal Chen to prepare a dish that combined American beef with Japanese seasonings and cooking methods. The result pleased no one completely, but satisfied everyone partially, creating a metaphor for the cultural understanding that had developed between former enemies. The shared kitchen work represented cooperation that would have been unimaginable just 1 month earlier. The farewell dinner featured both American barbecue and Japanese-inspired dishes, served on tables decorated with wildflowers gathered by the women during their afternoon walks around the compound. The informal decoration and mixed menu created an atmosphere unlike anything in either military tradition, something uniquely appropriate to their extraordinary circumstances. Major Williams delivered a brief speech through Akiko's translation, expressing hope that the women's families would welcome their return and that post-war relations between the nations might reflect the cooperation she had witnessed in their small camp. Her words carried political implications that extended far beyond their immediate situation. As the evening progressed, Private Rodriguez again brought out his guitar, and this time several Japanese women hummed along, with melodies they had learned during their weeks in captivity. The music created a soundtrack for conversations conducted through gestures, shared smiles, and the universal language of hospitality that had transformed enemies into something approaching friends. The meal concluded with both apple pie and traditional Japanese sweets that the women had managed to prepare using ingredients requisitioned from American supplies. This dessert exchange symbolized the cultural adaptation that had occurred on both sides, with Americans developing appreciation for subtle Asian flavors, while Japanese palates had expanded to accommodate bolder American tastes. References to this remarkable cross-cultural experience appear in declassified Army Medical Corps reports from the Pacific Theater, 1945 through 1946, documenting nutrition rehabilitation programs for prisoners of war. October 22nd brought the departure convoy that would transport the women to repatriation ships waiting at Yokohama. As they gathered their few possessions and prepared for departure, many carry small mementos of their American experience, recipes written in careful English, pressed flowers from the campgrounds, and memories of abundance that would sustain them through the uncertain years ahead. The American soldiers lined up to wish them farewell, creating an honor guard that honored their resilience rather than celebrating their defeat. Several women bowed deeply to individual soldiers who had shown particular kindness, while others simply nodded acknowledgement of shared humanity discovered in unexpected circumstances. Captain O'Brien later reported that the refeeding program had been medically successful, with all prisoners returning to healthy body weights and showing no signs of malnutrition-related diseases. However, her personal notes revealed her belief that the cultural exchange had been equally valuable, demonstrating that even in wartime, food could serve as a bridge between peoples separated by language, politics, and military conflict. The legacy of this small camp extended beyond its immediate participants. The successful nutrition rehabilitation program influenced post-war occupation policies regarding Japanese civilian feeding programs, while the cultural insights gained by American personnel informed diplomatic approaches during the Reconstruction period. Most significantly, the experience challenged assumptions about enemy populations and demonstrated the transformative power of basic human decency expressed through shared meals. For the Japanese women, their exposure to American abundance would shape their post-war perspectives on international relations, cultural differences, and the possibility of cooperation between former enemies. Their stories, shared with families and communities upon return, contributed to Japan's gradual acceptance of American influence during the occupation period and beyond.